Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm the CEO and co-founder with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We've been working with life science companies from across the globe over the past 12 years to help them virtualize everything from advisory board meetings, medical education events, investigator programs, even large corporate events with MSLs, salespeople, and they've been connecting really voraciously with payers, patients, physicians, allied healthcare providers. But more importantly, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with leading edge thinkers, with the digital provocateurs, with the leading bleeding edge entrepreneurs, we can all work to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. So at Impetus, we believe not only just starting these conversations, but asking ourselves the question of how do we sustain these? How do we build these authentic partnerships and these discussions so that we can really start to move healthcare in a forward direction? And that's really what we do at Impetus with our asynchronous communication tools. So I'm really pleased to have one of these leading edge thinkers. This is actually Dr. José Morey. He is actually a clinical radiologist who is passionate about harnessing technology, artificial intelligence, as well as all kinds of innovation to improve the human condition. He received his MD degree from the University of South Florida and is known as the first intergalactic doctor. So we're going to want to dig into what that means in a minute. He's the Eisenhower Fellow, Chief Medical Innovation Officer for Liberty BioSecurity. He's the CEO and founder of a company called Astra Media LLC, as well, if that wasn't enough, also the Director of Innovation and Chief Engineering Council Innovation Lead of Hyperloop Transportation Technologies. On top of all of that really impressive stuff, he's also the Senior Advisor to the Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology, the COVID-19 Project, and a Senior Advisor to the NASA AI Breathing Space Initiative. He previously served as the Associate Chief Health Officer and Senior Medical Scientist with IBM Watson Health. He has co-authored over 100 abstracts, book chapters, and articles, and is an international speaker on AI and technology innovation, including how to utilize AI in emerging tech to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Dr. Morey. So happy to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to Impetus Digital for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here.
I will have to tell you what an incredible, I've spoken to some really impressive people, but wow, what a resume. How on earth do you find the time to do all this? Tell us a little bit about starting your life as an MD and landing in all of these glamorous, and amazing places that you have arrived to today.
I appreciate the compliment, but it's really nothing's ever about one person, right? And usually people see the glamorous exclamation points at the end. They often don't see the harrowing times of multiple failures and obstacle overcoming that you have to do. So it's nice, but I fail a lot more than I succeed. People just like to talk about the successes. But to your question directly, I don't sleep all that much. I do try to actually be pretty healthy with my sleep, try to get about 8 hours as best I can. But it's constant. I don't see everything that I do is really, I see it as I'm playing. I don't see it as work. I really enjoy what I do. I could have never imagined my life would be the way it is. I never thought I'd be working on the projects that I'm working on. I feel very, very lucky to be doing it. But it takes an entire village to get you here. And I stand on the shoulders of many people. I'm from Puerto Rico originally. So a lot of Latino scientists that I stand on their shoulders, a lot of women scientists, I stand on their shoulders. And eventually whoever comes after me and does, really cool things will be standing to some degree on my shoulders. So I wear I carry that thought with me wherever I go, making sure that the next generation does better than this current generation, because we have to keep paying it forward. So, but my progress started when I was in medical school. I never thought I'd be in tech, but when I started towards the end of my residency, I started getting into research. I hated bench research. I did some bench research in med school, and it wasn't for me. I always thought I was going to be doing clinical medicine, but I decided towards the end of my career in residency to start doing research again, and I fell in love, especially with data analytics, because it wasn't bench research, right? It wasn't just working in a lab and doing science for the sake of science, although that's very much needed. And we wouldn't be having all the cool emerging tech if people weren't doing that, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But with data and with actually using real world applications of these emerging technologies, particularly AI, I found that you could actually do research and have a real world implication right away. So it helped my kind of ADD side where I could see, rapid satisfaction with something I was doing. And that opened up new avenues that I had never envisioned that I'd be going down. After that, I went to the University of Pennsylvania to do my fellowship. While I was there, I was lucky enough to have a friend that was doing his executive MBA at the Wharton School. So I was able to do some projects with him around entrepreneurship. Philadelphia has a really cool accelerators and startup community, and that's really where I got into the startup bug and the technology bug. And then I had my first big opportunity to work with IBM as an advisor, and then that role expanded. Eventually worked full time with IBM. And then after I started working with IBM, that opened up new avenues, especially since that took me more out to San Jose and San Francisco and Silicon Valley kind of region, where I was able to really be around an ecosystem that kind of nurtured exploration and innovation. Really, what is the art of the possible? Always continually dreaming, always asking if can something be done, and exploring what the possibilities of attempting to accomplish those goals. And all these new avenues, I saw them really as extensions of my healthcare practice. I'm always a physician at my core, and I believe that the way that I've been trained in medicine has allowed me to think critically in ways that other particular fields perhaps don't train you to do. We are trained to evaluate multiple data sets and try to take all those data sets and siphon them down to a top, what we call differential diagnosis, right? A top 1, 2, 3 possibilities of what a good solution is for what is going on. Well, really in emerging technology and really in innovation, that's what you're doing. You have a problem set, which is oftentimes multifactorial, oftentimes very complex, and you have to be able to diagnose what the best solution is. And you come up with a differential, and then you have to go and do further testing, right? Further analysis, further R&D, and eventually you come to hopefully what's the right solution or the best solution based on the current data set that you have. So that really translated well in my medical training to entrepreneurship and innovation. And that opened up new avenues because I was taking the way I was trained and applying it to a new problem. And I see it as an extension as my healthcare, not just based on the way I was trained, but really on the scope of practice. When you're a physician, you're limited to the number of people that you can see and you can help on a daily basis, right? You're one person, so you can only see so many people in a single day. But when you're working with artificial intelligence, when you're working on utilizing these new types of technologies, you have the capability to help people that you will never see, that will never know that you were a part of their care in some capacity, whether it's developing an AI application that will outlive you and go on into perpetuity to be able to help so many people. Or if you develop a brand new innovation that perhaps is not directly related to healthcare, but it's directly related to well-being, perhaps it's improving communication or improving travel or improving just quality of life. And that's the other thing that I think physicians sometimes don't tend to think so much. They get so hyper-focused on their one subspecialty that they tend to kind of stand back and look at their patient as a 360-degree view of how they live, of who they are, of the soul and the being that is before them. And I think if we started viewing it from that perspective, you'd have more physicians that enter kind of the technology and entrepreneurial world. And I honestly believe that we need more physicians in these roles, because especially as tech tries to get into healthcare and well-being, it's a different perspective when you're a physician. It's very different than perhaps someone that's coding or working on ones and zeros tends to view life. When you're working with someone as a healthcare provider, you see them at their most vulnerable, and you understand that the try fast, fail fast mentality has to be slowed down to a certain degree, because the implications of failing when you're dealing with real people, the consequences are much bigger, right? It's not just the consequences of one individual life. There are ripples of that person. They have family, they have friends, they have other circles that they affect. So coming to it with a more humanistic perspective that clinical medicine tends to give you, I think it's something that's very important and very needed in the tech sector, especially with some of these newer things that are affecting humanity.
I love it. You've talked about so many important things. I want to see if I can grab a few of these and maybe linger on them. You really mentioned a lot, and I think it's important to point out the traditional or the legacy world that we're now emerging from. I think with COVID, there's been a confluence of factors that have literally accelerated the digitalization of the world that we live in today. Mm. And so some of these were probably inevitabilities, as Kevin Kelly would often say in many of his really great books, one of them called The Inevitable or The Inevitables. And, so some of this we're probably predisposed to change already. But when we think about some of these legacy frameworks, specifically physician education and a typical way that a physician is educated, the curriculum, it's these standard things. And we're suddenly hit with this world of, the digital revolution. And we're hearing telemedicine, and we're seeing Bluetoothed, types of diagnostics, liquid biopsies, and on it goes, literally to the point of physicians becoming data scientists. What sort of recommendations would you make as you sort of delve into this world of physicians discovering the world of entrepreneurship, the business world? What changes would you suggest happen in the curriculum of many medical schools across the globe? And what sorts of, if you were to talk to your younger self as a blossoming physician, what sort of direction would you give somebody today as to the direction of the things that they should be thinking about?
Well, one thing in general that I tend to kind of use as a soapbox is I'm a strong advocate that coding should really be taught as a second language to everyone, not just physicians. I think we should be embedding coding really in everything that we do. And we really need to start thinking about education is to train people to be critical thinkers and to be innovators. I think that's been I don't think it's 100% across the board. I don't think it should be for everyone. I think we need to have a span of different types of learning modalities. I mean, our educational system, the way we devised it, not just healthcare, but in general, right? We devised it for the industrial age, for manufacturing age. And we devised it for really to try to make everyone fit that mold. And it works for many people, but there are a lot of people that it doesn't work for. And we need to be changing our educational model across the board for everyone. But one thing that I think needs to be put into to a certain degree for a large group of individuals, if not almost the majority, is really coding as that second language, as I mentioned, because data analytics and artificial intelligence is really going to affect, it's not just healthcare physicians' lives, it's affecting everyone's lives. I mean, there are applications that you use on a daily basis that everyone that listens to your show uses on a daily basis that have ramifications that come from data analytics and from artificial intelligence. And we have to, just like any tool, if you get taught to use a hammer or a car or anything you use to augment humanity, right? Because the way we evolve, there's a lot of limitations to, what we have. Our 5 fingers and our 2 feet are only so much. And we've been continually trying to augment that evolution with technology since we created fire. These new tools that we have to understand their limitations, just like you wouldn't use a hammer when you need a screwdriver, and vice versa. Artificial intelligence and these other things have limitations to them, and we have to be able to be cognizant of those limitations, because if we do not, we can run into the problems as you've seen perhaps in the criminal justice system or in other systems, these new applications that end up perpetuating systemic biases because they're limited by the data that they had. If people had that understanding that we're implementing those limitations, they wouldn't utilize it, because they would say, oh no, well, this isn't ready for this particular application. It's great for something else, But for this particular application, because it's of its limitations, it shouldn't be used in this setting at this moment. In the future, sure, but in this setting, at this moment, with the limitations that this tool has right now, we shouldn't be doing it. And if we had an understanding, we had a general understanding into all of our society, into all of our different industries of data, the pros and the cons of machine learning, the pros and the cons of emerging technology, the pros and the cons, then I think people that are in those industries would make wiser decisions, just like they do when they understand other aspects of their industry. They say, oh, well, that technology won't work because I understand my industry. Well, they also understand that technology to a certain degree. So coding is one that I think needs to be put into everything. In physicians as well, and my earlier self, that's something I would have said start earlier. Start learning these basic understandings, these basic coding infrastructure, because they're going to have so many ramifications into everything that you do, that you want to learn it so you can incorporate it, and other types of technologies too as they're evolving, whether it's additive manufacturing, whether it's quantum computing, all these things that are coming out, VR, AR, XR. It's very important to have at least a general understanding of them. And then when needed, a deeper understanding, as a project arises. What I like to say is being a jack of all trades and a master as needed. So you have a general understanding of everything, but when it comes time, you have the foundation of how you study and dig deep into that particular subtype of technology to be able to glean everything that you need from that to be able to apply it to a particular project or a particular scope of work that you're working on. So that's what I would tell my younger self, and that's what I would tell really everyone going forward. And a second thing I would say is really incorporate more creativity. Usually I work with a lot of technology companies, and if they ask me to build a team out for them, they're usually looking for an engineer, right? They're usually looking for whatever, XYZ, computer scientist, mechanical engineer, whatever. But I usually try to bring in someone that brings a humanistic perspective, often some sort of artist. People tend to forget that humanity is at its core what technology should be about. So bringing in that creativity, bringing in that spark, bringing in that outside the box, or what I like to call is a no box type of thinker that doesn't see any sort of limitations whatsoever. That's how you really get to innovation. That's how you really problem solve with ingenuity. So bringing in more creativity, more art, more artistry, more appreciation for those kinds of things that makes us human. I tend to think of, what are we going to take with us from Earth, 100, 1,000, 10,000 years from now? What will be that strain of code that we can look back and say, oh, that came from Earth. That's so interesting that you use that word or that phrase, or we create buildings in a certain manner because we've brought that with us. And I think we have to keep putting more humanity into technology to try to help bring us together, because technology is a tool, and it has the capacity potentially to separate us, as we've seen with things like social media and whatnot. It can be utilized in nefarious ways, and we have to really be bringing the humanity back into things, whether it's in medical training or other training.
Yeah, so Dr. Morey, you bring up some really important points, and like literally I could probably go off on tangents on every single topic that we're discussing here. But when you brought up the concept of being nefarious, and so without getting into the politics of this, but we are observing some very interesting things in society today in a way that we've never have before, really, because there's vehicles now for amplification of messaging and information. Knowledge is free today. And data is everywhere. So what we are noticing is that we could have two originally very scientific, factual things happening in two people. And those two individuals could literally be experiencing that sense of reality in a completely different way, and observe it and perceive it and discuss it as if something completely different happened. And so we hear things about like the K economy. We hear about disparity, inclusion and exclusion, and all kinds of these things that are happening. Even with COVID-19, the very essence behind vaccination, is it real? Or are people putting something in to your body and injecting it and taking over the world and all these other things? And there's huge swaths of the population that are believing this. If we're kind of going down this roadmap of saying, science is the way, coding is the way, this is kind of the new religion. Are there people and populations popping up that are countering that? Is this something, and again, we hear all the times about security and issues and privacy, and there's new belief systems and perspectives that are cropping up that one would never have even assumed would exist, that is happening today. Is this going to become a detriment for us? How do we live in a society with so much, with so many different perspectives and ideas surfacing from everywhere?
What I view it as, every time you iterate, every time you innovate, there are unforeseen consequences of that. There are good things about that, and there are bad things about that. The negative aspects, and I go back to something I referenced earlier, in Silicon Valley and in the tech and innovation sector, everyone is very good about asking if something can be done, right? Can we do that? But seldom do people stop to think of should something be done, or what are the ramifications of doing that. They just simply ask, can we do it to begin with, and then go out and do it. And that's one of the amazing things about innovation. That's the big driving force of humanity and of Silicon Valley and of what's been driving innovation in the US and in other countries. But stopping to ask should, that's where the humanistic component comes into. And I think my perspective, I think it can be fixed, to your direct answer. I think it can be fixed, but I think it takes cognizant and intentionality on evaluating and saying we have a problem. It's just like any other kind of issue, whether it's personal, familial, whether it's industry, sector, company. You first have to admit that there's an issue, and then you have to go and analyze that issue and then fix the problem. How do you fix it? Well, my personal perspective is twofold. I believe that we need to have a board, especially at a governmental level, similar to the FDA, a regulatory body, an EPA, that evaluates technologies as they're coming out to make sure, number one, that they don't perpetuate systemic inequalities in any capacity, understanding how the technology works, and making sure that it's not going to, institute anything that's been instituted in the past, or continue it at least. And then I think that same body needs to be reevaluating things every 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever number, pick N, to make sure that these ramifications that these unforeseen consequences, making sure that we go back and say, all right, there are certain things that have occurred now. Let's go back and rethink. Let's go put in some new checks, some new balances, some new regulations. And I think you're seeing that a little bit now, both from the governmental perspective and from the private sector perspective. You're seeing those checks and balances. I don't think we're there yet, because it's a much bigger problem with the underlying algorithms and the way people can create new applications. It's a bit of a Wild West. So how do you kind of make sure that you're not, the balance, it goes into the political thing, the balance between free speech and the balance between personal privacy to say things or to live the way you want to live, but then also making sure that those personal beliefs aren't harming other people. That's a much more sensitive conversation. But from a tech perspective, from a regulatory perspective, I think you can put in checks and balances to try to help mitigate things as best as you can, without becoming some sort of 1984 kind of control state. So that's the fine balance that we have to play in the West. But I think there are ways to fix it, and there are ways to make things better. But that's why I always tell people, you got to go back to the humanity, what brings us together. So focusing on the fact that we want to create new technologies that are for everyone and that are making life better for everyone, and not causing unforeseen consequences that can lead to things like people not wanting to get vaccinated, or to creating all sorts of other conspiracies that have led directly to loss of life, in different aspects. That we have to own the fact that there are issues, that we have our own internal issues, and that we have to kind of put checks and balances to do the best we can to make sure that those things don't keep happening.
Absolutely, for sure. So lingering on that concept around inclusion, diversity, sort of reducing the barriers, if you will, to entry of everybody being able to participate in the conversation, being able to allow individuals to understand the language of code the language of the future, and not to be undermined or skirted around through algorithms that nobody understands. And so you have actually started an amazing effort around a company called Astra Media, where you're really kind of focusing on sort of underprivileged, underserved communities, kids, teenagers, and getting them excited around what we're now calling STEAM. So science, technology, engineering, arts, which is the new part, which I think you're adding as the element of the artistry, if you will, of science, and then mathematics, so STEAM. Tell us a little bit about how that emerged as part of a brainchild of yourself.
Yeah.
Why hitting those underserved kids, and tell us how you've kind of integrated this whole edutainment piece to STEAM training.
Sure. Thank you for that question, because it's something that I'm very passionate about, which I think you've already seen it come out a little bit in the things I've been saying. And it's because we've seen so many reasons for it. A perfect example, I was on a panel recently talking about the movie. I don't know if you've seen the documentary Coded Bias at all. Came out of the work, that phenomenal work that Joey Bolawini from MIT Media Lab did, about showing that artificial intelligence in the criminal justice system is biased. These facial recognition algorithms are biased. And the reason that it was biased is because the training sets were biased. And that's the thing about AI, right? AI at its core, it's data and math at its very simplistic form. And it doesn't matter how fancy your math gets, if the data is in error, if the data is biased, then the outcome is going to be biased. So that is one of the reasons, because we've seen that again and again and again and again. And then the other major thing, if you had if you look at the people who create these algorithms or work on these technologies, it tends to be one gender, it tends to be one socioeconomic status, one ethnicity. If you had perhaps a little bit more diversity in the origination of the application, then those people, you can't say for sure, right? Because you can't say what didn't happen, but more than likely, people would have stopped and said, well, perhaps we should put a little bit more diversity in that data set if we're going to be creating something that's going to be for everyone. Let's be a little bit more inclusive. And from a capitalistic perspective, it's better if you're more inclusive and you end up creating a better application. And there's a lot of data out there showing that the more inclusive you are, having more women in leadership positions at the top of the food chain, those things end up being better for the company, ends up being better for the economy, ends up being better for the government. All those things are data points as to what led me to this. Then in my speaking opportunities, I apologize, I hit the microphone there, but in the speaking opportunities, you talk to kids nowadays, and kids are very interested in especially underserved kids. When you speak to Latino communities or urban communities, when you ask kids, I'll have kids stand up and I'll typically ask them a couple of questions. And, you can ask kids, who you follow on Instagram, who's your favorite athlete you follow? And everybody, has somebody and will shout it out. Who's your favorite artist that you follow? And everybody has somebody and shouts it out. Well, if you ask them, who's your favorite scientist? It's not that much. There's a handful of people that they may know, but realistically, most kids, they don't see that as a viable option for them to elevate themselves, their family, their communities. They see these other methods as much more viable. But in reality, it's much harder to create 10,000 LeBron James than it is to create 10,000 nurses, right? 10,000 microbiologists. And if you can elevate people into the STEM fields, that changes so much. You can revolutionize an entire ecosystem of individuals. You can generate wealth. I mean, these STEAM jobs, those are the jobs right now that don't get affected as much by pandemics, right? Who are the people that's been disaffected so much by the pandemic? It's been BIPOC, it's been people of color, people of underserved communities. And it's multifaceted, but one of those reasons is because we as a whole don't tend to have the opportunity to go into those fields. You look at medicine as a whole, African-American representation in medicine, in particular men, is horrific. It's less than like 2%, the last numbers that I checked, but it's a huge problem. And you see that at the executive boards, you see that in all aspects of STEAM. And then one of the things that hit close to home was the hurricanes and the earthquakes that happened over the last couple of years in Puerto Rico, where I'm from, and seeing that our economy, which is so much based on tourism and understanding how climate change is going to change is been affecting that. If we could diversify, then the what I call the comorbidities of being low socioeconomic, the things of all the deserts you can think of, whether it's a food desert, whether it's a healthcare desert, an education desert, a digital desert, those things tend to be ameliorated as the socioeconomic status rises. So the whole focus was to let's go and fix that pipeline that, as the STEM Honor Society people say, that K to career pipeline, where you can create and inspire kids, right? That concept of if you can't see it, you can't be it. So try to create educational content, educational entertaining content, so edutainment, that not only teaches that these are things that you can do, but shows diversity in those things. So all the content that we create, it's all about showing diversity in a different scientific or technological field. And we do it in a way to try to reach the kids at different age groups, so that they can see themselves and say, oh, well, look at that little girl, or look at that little boy who looks like me or talks like me or comes from where I come from. They're doing this. They're a doctor. They're a nurse. They're a XYZ STEM, industry. So that's why this is important and why this is a passion of mine, because we need to elevate and make sure that the playing field is level, because then we hopefully won't see the ramifications that we're seeing in technology today, where we're not being cognizant that the things that we are creating could potentially have implications to people that don't look like us.
Absolutely. Yeah, fantastic. So I've noticed as well too that you have been involved with NASA. Specifically, you worked on this thing called the AI Breathing Space Initiative.
Yeah.
And then, as part of that, I'm sure that you have brought some of that thinking, that intergalactic thinking, space thinking, again, thinking of Elon Musk and things that Jeff Bezos is working on, and everybody else doing space travel, et cetera. You've brought in this concept called the Chopin in Space Children's Initiative. You also have the INTERgalactic Academy, and most importantly, you're called the first intergalactic doctor. How does this all entangle each other? How did you get involved in space, and how are you bringing this concept of the aspiration to become an astronaut to younger children as being the new LeBron James, or the new thing to aspire to become?
Yeah. Well, the way I started getting involved with space, obviously, I think everybody is enamored with space to a certain degree, right? And there's something, even early humanity, we've always been looking to the stars and seen it as a source of inspiration. I think it's something that's encoded into our natural evolution, perhaps maybe because we, if you go back far enough, we come from stardust in a way. So perhaps we just see it as ourselves and an extension of ourselves, which is kind of cool to think of. So
we're all just fractals of stardust.
Exactly, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So the first foray that I was able to work with NASA was actually through their NASA iTech project. So iTech was, and still is, an accelerator that I still help, that was created to solve the solutions or the problems, create solutions for the problems that we have to become a multiplanetary species. Specifically, how do we reach Mars? How do we colonize Mars? How do we stay on Mars? And that started maybe 5-6 years ago now. I was at IBM still at that time. And so they were looking for subject matter experts, particularly people that had knowledge of both medicine and artificial intelligence, because a lot of it really is not, we have a bunch of robots and satellites already on Mars. Really, the rate limiting step is our biology. So understanding both aspects from an AI perspective and a AI healthcare perspective and a physiology perspective is something that they were looking to get help with. I happen to have both of those expertise, and it was a project that started out of the area that I live in, Eastern Virginia. So that's my first foray. And then since then, I've been able to work on several projects through various companies, both Hyperloop, Liberty BioSecurity, and others, helping NASA work in collaboration with these emerging technology companies to solve those solution sets of what is it that we need to get to these other places, and not just be there, but thrive there and explore there and create new industries. NASA is very much about those public-private partnerships. And so I've been very lucky to work on several of these projects. And that's really why they gave me the moniker. Someone wrote an article and started calling me the Intergalactic Doctor, because I'm a physician by formal training, but I work with cutting edge and bleeding edge, as you mentioned, technology companies, and often a lot of them end up subcontracting or working in some capacity or doing research with NASA. So that's how the intergalactic doctor came up.
Yeah, and so the work that you're doing, and like it all kind of makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, the essence behind all of this is to one day be able to survive. A lot of times people talk about the earlier explorers in the Antarctic and what that experience was like. I think Elon Musk referred to that recently. That's what it's going to be like, and for the initial pioneers of the people who are going to be trying to excavate Mars. Some people make it, some people don't, but it's going to be very much of that, have no idea what you're getting into, and you just use the human ingenuity and perseverance to make it through. But all the work that you're doing, including at Liberty BioSecurity, is really interesting. Some of the work that you're working on around novel isolates, I think a specific project called Nanowire, where you're really trying to get in and it's trying to classify and understand human genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, like the underlying biologies, amino acids, or the way everything kind of puts together in the genetic code. And somehow, is there something that one can do to accelerate change, modify that whole piece in an accelerated way to enable a human to live in a completely different environment? Can you speak to what that looks like?
Sure, yeah. So Liberty specifically has been working with planetary defense out of JPL. Planetary defense works on various capacities. I think what most people are the most familiar with is anytime they hear like a near Earth object, an asteroid coming, it's going to pass between the moon and Earth, or the closest thing we've seen in 50 years. I'm sure people have read those articles periodically. That's one of the things that planetary defense works on. The other aspects, though, that they evaluate is extreme bacteria, which is the expertise of Liberty BioSecurities and what they work with planetary defense on. So understanding how bacteria live and grow and evolve in extreme environments helps humanity and space exploration understand the types of life that we could potentially find on other planets. And it helps us develop a couple of things. One, it helps us develop the tools to be able to identify life in these other planets. And it also helps us plan accordingly for when we potentially bring back life from those planets, to make sure that we don't have what we call reverse contamination. So in space exploration, we think about two types of contamination from a planetary defense perspective. One is forward contamination. So it's bacteria or viruses or things that we take with us to these other planets, to understand that obviously when we send a robotic system up, we try to make sure that it is as clean as possible so that we don't have any kind of terrestrial flora go up with it, or fauna, microbes, viruses, so that we don't have, as if you have any Trekkies out there, we don't have like the prime directive being affected, so that we don't affect the evolution of that other planet by sending something up there. And then when reverse contamination is that when we bring microbial life back, or other types of life eventually when we find it, that we don't cause some sort of cataclysmic event here on Earth, by understanding how we could potentially mitigate those kinds of things. So the more we study extreme bacteria, and technologies like Nanowire are built to expedite and be able to identify those kinds of genomic understanding of those things, the better we can defend ourselves, both from contamination that we send and potential contamination that we bring back. But as a side effect of all those things, extreme bacteria, viruses, fungi, they've developed really unique biological weapons to do a lot of things that other people can't. So we can learn from them, just like we learn from evolution, so many other industries, to be able to utilize the weapons that they have evolved over time to be able to help us here, whether it be to create really amazing sun protection, like UV protection, applications that we've been developing, or be able to knock down biofilms or new types of antibiotics because of bacteria fighting other bacteria. So those are the kinds of things that you can learn, and you can actually have real world validation. I know some people talk about, why focus so much on space when there's other things to be fixing here on Earth. But realistically, space exploration and space science has given us so many things here on Earth. The very fact that we have telecommunication like we have right now, where we can Zoom that technology came from space technology. We wouldn't even have what everyone uses on a daily basis to communicate now during a pandemic if it wasn't for space science. So much of the things that work on your phone come from space science. So many things in medicine, whether it's defibrillators or other types of monitoring devices, come specifically from space science. So space science is human science. Everything we know about climate change comes from space science because we've been evaluating to understand how our planet is evolving so that we can understand how other planets potentially have evolved over time. So space science is earth science.
Yeah, and I actually agree. And I just want to sort of add to that. It's kind of interesting because if you think about it, sometimes we need to use an abstraction like space sort of to unfetter our imagination, because as soon as we place the scientific rigor on the planet Earth, suddenly all of the gravitas of ideas and preventions and why you can't do something, it's just like gravity prevents you from blossoming your thinking.
Yeah,
So in some ways, doing this in space is an abstraction that allows the imagination to flourish. So
absolutely.
I think it might be just another way to view it. I think that what's really interesting here as well too is you're doing, like, as I'm sort of looking at your world, it suddenly makes sense to me about everything that you're doing, even the Hyperloop work. So this idea around how to do travel potentially in space, I mean, and then bringing it back to Earth. Tell us a little bit about some of that work that you have kind of brought to the table, and why are you involved in the work associated with the Hyperloop Transportation Technologies Group?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for asking. So it was actually NASA did some of the early research on Hyperloop after Elon Musk's and the SpaceX white paper came out. Glenn Research Center actually did a lot of analysis of Hyperloop viability, because in space, obviously, you don't have the Hyperloop. For the few people on your podcast that may not know, I'm assuming probably pretty much your entire podcast folks or webinar folks know about it, but it's essentially a magnetic levitation train or high speed train inside a vacuum. So the whole purpose of it is when you have a vacuum, you don't have the wind resistance, which is the limitation that you had for traditional high speed transportations right now. So you already have that system or that environment in space. So that's why NASA actually explored it and looked at it to see if it would be a viable mechanism of travel potentially on Mars or other planets where it's very similar to the environment that the tube is trying to create. So that was the collaboration. One of the major things that I see, especially from a Hyperloop perspective, is as things evolve. I mean, Hyperloop has the potential to be one of the safest forms of travel. You talk about not having to worry about the climate changing because you're in a protective environment. So it doesn't matter if there's turbulence or there's a bad storm, you'll be able to get in and out without being affected by those kinds of things. Same thing in cases of a major calamity, say a hurricane coming in. It's a way that you can move massive amount of people out of something like that that's affected by climate change, and then also from an economic perspective, be able to move goods and supplies back to those facilities in a very rapid manner. So it's really the next evolution of transportation. We haven't had a revolution in transportation in decades. We've been flying by planes for such a long time. Same thing with cars. I mean, there's been incremental change, but there hasn't been a revolution in transportation in a long time. So it's going to develop and it's going to be the future. So I see this developing in a real world perspective. We already have so many real world testing sites from different companies around the globe, but we're going to start seeing people utilize this hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, most likely potentially in the Middle East as the first kind of real world applications that we're going to see it. But I'm a strong proponent of travel in general and of breaking down barriers, because you've seen how diversity has expanded as transportation has evolved, right? Whether it's the metro system or whether it's cars, or whether it's planes, As the world gets smaller with these new types of evolutions to augment our limited legs, before people could only go, a couple miles from where they were ever born, because unfortunately that's what we evolved. But as we've developed these new augmentations to our mobility, we've been able to understand other people's way of thinking, how other people look, and be able to be more diverse as generations evolve. Hyperloop is the next evolution of increasing diversity and inclusion, because people will be able to expand their reach and be able to have more understanding of other people. And I see that as a very big component of trying to be more inclusive. The more you can travel, the more you can experience other ways of thinking, other ways of being, the more you are accepting. Because at the end of the day, what breaks down barriers most is not understanding. It's fear, it's lack of knowledge. I've never met someone like that. I've never met someone that has that kind of a lifestyle or thinks that kind of way or looks that particular way. But once you start incorporating them into your daily life, or once you have exposure to them, the fear goes away, because you start to realize, what, they're just like me. They just happen to look a little different or think a little different, but at the core, we're all human. So that's why I'm a big proponent of increasing these types of technologies.
So this is a wonderful world of opportunity, possibility, limitless ways of being and doing. And again, you're getting lots of different factions of thinking here. You have the utopians and the dystopians, people like Nick Bostra and others, even a little bit like Elon Musk. Is this in favor or against us? But the idea here is you're really talking about human augmentation. It actually is starting right now on Earth. And when we're talking about like cyborgs or like just implantations of different things, even wearables, the clothing that we're wearing to enable us to do things, and to even things like ambient biometrics, liquid biopsies. These are all things that are moving towards this augmented person, the 24-hour glucose monitoring. So we're just seamlessly sending biofeedback and having this way of an N=1 with precision medicine of how we're monitoring, measuring our own health against ourselves. But the question kind of comes down to is our mental capacity, are able to keep up with this pace of the accelerated cyborg transformation? Are we seeing some of the effects of this even with what's happened with COVID, some mental fatigue, some mental unwellness, not being able to keep up? Is, for example, the Elon Musk, Neuralink, the answer to that, where we're suddenly going to augment the brain, becoming part of the more collective consciousness, and increasing the speed and the bandwidth of our mind by tapping into the internet? So how do we transfer this biological transformation and keep the brain or the mind or the consciousness keeping up with that speed?
Yeah, I think you're 100% correct. I don't think we are keeping up with it. I think Thomas Friedman, and thank you for being late, spoke on this. The rate of innovation is so rapid, and that's why I'm a big proponent of the way you do it, both from a personal perspective and from an enterprise perspective. When I speak to companies, or governmental perspective, when I'm speaking to those groups, is really incorporating STEAM. So I use Leonardo da Vinci as the avatar of how you stay as nimble as possible in the way that you think and in the way that the organism and the enterprise evolves. So incorporating different aspects of science, different aspects of technology, different aspects of art. And that's where I go back to that concept of a jack of all trades and a master as needed. You have to be understanding that both as an individual and as a system, whether it's enterprise or government, you have to be constantly learning and learning multiple facets of multiple different subject matter areas, so that you can stay as innovative and as malleable as possible, especially because of the rate of exponential change that we're having today. We have to be thinking, and we have to create more Leonardos in the way that they think, in the way that they operate, both at a personal level and at a company and at a government level, to be able to keep up with it. And that's just from an organic evolutionary perspective. I think over time you will see where evolution takes time. So eventually we could hopefully catch up to it. But what we've been doing as humans, since we've developed technology, since the advent of fire, going back to that phrase, we've been creating ways to keep up with change and be able to keep up with different types of innovations. I mean, our phone, all of us have a computer that we're constantly attached to through our phones or other types of edge devices. And this next
Sorry,
evolution.
Jose, can I just actually interrupt you? Is there something happened with your microphone? Because I'm getting a real fuzzy sound. Can you just double check?
Sure.
Nothing happened or?
Nothing changed now.
Okay, sorry, maybe
Here,
something just happened with the channel
I,
here.
I just took off that microphone. Is that better? I took out the Yeti.
Yeah, it's fine. Just continue. Maybe it's just my headset.
Sure. So yeah, so the other things I was saying is to keep up. I do think that we've already had augmentations of combining ourselves with computers to a certain degree, and I think it will just continue. Neuralink is a potential outcome of that, of embedding things with computers. I mean, it's not that much of a stretch. A lot, there's certain people data coming out that some people spend 80% of their lives online now, whether it be through just their phones or VR or other types of augmentations. We're not that far away from some people spending 100% of their lives online. And a lot of people see their digital life sometimes as equal or greater of importance than their biological life, even nowadays. So I do see an amalgamation of that going forward. I think it's something that we've always done. I don't think it's new or it's abnormal. It's something we've always been doing since we've been creating technology. So it's just a natural extension of what we've been doing for millennia now. And to Elon's kind of perspective of the first ones to go out into space and whatnot. Yeah, I think realistically, exploration, especially at the edge of human evolution, is always going to be dangerous, and there are going to be risks to our biological selves. And I think anyone that's involved in that understands that. And I don't think I think it's expected. I think people will still sign up to push that because it's part of humanity to be explorers, right? I think Carl
Yeah,
Sagan's mottos and speeches.
absolutely. So it's a very exciting world, Dr. Morey, and I guess only time will tell if we are going to find that some people unfortunately are not going to catch the train because it's moving at a very rapid pace. And I hope that we're not in a place where the K economy is replicative of what people's adoption of technology. And again, we've talked a little bit about conspiracy theories. Is this the new evil? Do I stay on this side of the line versus the other, and staying away from it? And are they going to miss the train? So I think only time will tell to see what this looks like. I hope it's not going to be a Darwinian enactment of what's to happen, but we will see. I think this is a great way to end the show. We could literally talk for hours. You have so many great ideas. I love what you're working on. It all makes sense. It's so well-rounded. It's all going in this phenomenal direction. I'm really enjoying it. I wish we could talk for more hours, and maybe we'll have you back on the show to learn about more what you're doing. For anybody who is interested in connecting with Dr. Morey, pharmaceutical companies, other companies, entrepreneurs, people who want to connect, we will be leaving his contact information in the show notes. So please look for that. I'm sure he's going to be very happy to include you in future conversations. Please check out impetusdigital.com. If you enjoyed this conversation and you're a company that wants to explore new ideas, new concepts, come up with new protocols, information, and discover new ideas, this is what we do at Impetus. We help you to put together a series of asynchronous and synchronous touch points with your key stakeholders so you emerge smarter, better. You have things that you can actually start working on and delivering into the world. We are super excited about that. So please like and subscribe to this channel so that others can find this information. We really enjoyed and appreciated you being here. Thank you, Dr. Jose Morey. Phenomenal work. We wish you the best of luck moving forward, and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.